Good afternoon and welcome to today's episode of Village Talk, the 3 series of conversations exploring the village concept among the African American culture. I am Judy Matthews, chair of the San Gabriel chapter of the National Congress of Black Women Incorporation. I would like to take a moment to first thank Ernestine Tina Wyatt, the series host, Pamela Burton, moderator, and the distinguished panel for your commitment and time addressing the village concept experience on today's history of Juneteenth. The National Congress of Black Women is a 501c nonprofit organization which serves as a nonpartisan voice of advocacy on issues affecting the appointment of women at all levels of government, with a goal to increase the participation of women of color in the educational, political, economic, and social arenas. The organization's program benefits thousands of people annually, and the work with many organizations that represent varying ethnic backgrounds. The San Gabriel Valley chapter is dedicated to the mission of the organization. We serve the communities of San Gabriel Valley and its surrounding areas by engaging and empowering African American families through awareness and understanding of how to better their communities through educational and cultural development. The National Congress of Black Women continues to make notable contributions to not only their communities, but to our country, the great United States of America. I would like to introduce you to Ernestine Tina Wyatt, the host and great grandniece of Harriet Tubman, who will introduce the panelists and begin this informative discussion. Ernestine?
Thank you, Judy. Today we celebrate Juneteenth, a day that those still in bondage in Texas were not notified until June 19th, 1865, that slaves in the Confederate States had been set free 2 years prior on January 1st, 1863. On June 17th, 2021, Juneteenth was signed into law as a federal holiday, yet today, slavery still exists in part. This bitter root steeped in systemic racism is choking and destroying our communities, and we see the results of a plague of racist hatred being manifested in our communities through the anger that has been turned inwardly, becoming self-hatred, and exhibited as suicide in our young. In addition, it is seen as in an epidemic of drugs and alcohol abuse as well. Then you take this self-hatred and turn it outwardly, seen through non-caring, unloving acts such as shootings and domestic abuse and much more. Although we hold each other and ourselves responsible for any acts of destruction, it is made more difficult to heal when the system batters away, oppresses, minimizes, and marginalizes you so that you do not see yourself as a man or a woman. Today, hopefully, we will learn of tools that we can use to heal the wounds of our culture from within, of the effects of systemic racism, and being fully restored, passing this on to future generations. Now, I would also like to introduce our moderator, Pamela Burton. Pamela is an information technologist and IT project manager for the city of Pasadena. Her desire to expand and deepen her passion for spiritual growth opportunities, community engagement, and exploring the glorious process of maturing as a Black woman has led her to her current role as first chair for the National Congress of Black Women, San Gabriel Valley chapter. Today, she will be representing National Congress of Black Women as our fabulous moderator. Pamela?
Thank you very much, Tina, and also to Judy. It's a pleasure to join you again as moderator for Village Talk Part 3, especially on this glorious day as we just spoke, as we and now the country celebrates Juneteenth. Good afternoon to our returning guests and welcome to our latest guest. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you've heard some great things about our event. As with previous Village Talk presentations, this afternoon brings together 4 dynamic presenters, the best in their field, to educate, inspire, and promote healing as we explore the impacts of systemic racism. From its impacts to education, to the trauma it inflicts on our daily lives and our health, as well as the impact to so many of our shared brothers and sisters that are re-entering the world from prison. Our presenters will provide you the tools, the language, the knowledge for meaningful change in your lives, your family's lives, family, health, and the community. But before I introduce our presenter, I want to give a brief review of today's interaction discussion. After our 4 presenters give their presentation, we're going to break into 4 groups, kind of like breakout sessions, where each presenter will continue in a more in-depth conversation about their presentation. It's going to be kind of in a round robin process. So for all of you online that are not necessarily great Zoom navigators, don't worry, you don't have to do anything. We're going to go ahead and handle it for you. So once you're in the breakout room, we will kind of round robin the presenters to each of you. So it's going to be a fun event that way. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our 4 fabulous presenters for today. When I stand before God at the end of my life, I would hope that I would not have a single bit of talent left and could say, I used everything you gave me. A quote from Irma Bombeck. This quote is a perfect introduction to Kimberley Grayson, the honored and privileged principal of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Early College in Denver, Colorado. The quote above also exemplifies her personal philosophy of teaching. She firmly believes that each day she walks into her office, and I will quote, "It is my utmost priority to use every bit of my talent, skill, knowledge, and resource available to instill self-confidence in my students and adults, remain relentless in helping them succeed, and to endorse and promote the value of professional collaboration and effective leadership." As you will see and hear, along with her students, Kimberley is confident that together we can create a positive learning environment for all of our students. Evangeline Covington, Esquire. Evangeline is an attorney, social justice advocate, educator, and writer. Over the past 10 years, she has provided both in-person and online domestic violence and human trafficking awareness and prevention training. She's also a certified trauma healing facilitator and founder of Compassionate JusticeWorks, which provides consultant and support services to individuals, organizations, and businesses to introduce awareness of the effects of trauma on individuals, families, communities, and provide training in trauma healing based on sound biblical and mental health principles. Savannah Eldrige is a registered nurse and is the founder of Be Frank for Justice, an organization that supports men and women incarcerated in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice with navigating through that post-conviction process. She formed Be Frank for Justice when she realized barriers such as lack of procedural knowledge and limited access to legal references material while assisting her brother Frank with his appeal of a life sentence under an outdated habitual offender status in Texas. Through the organization, she advocates for meaningful change to the criminal legal system and the empowerment of system impacts on families. Dr. Wendy Webster. or I should repeat, Dr. Wendy W. Webster Jackson is a Southfield, Michigan resident and business owner. As a podiatrist, medical and surgical physician with over 20 years experience, Dr. Webster has a private office in Southfield, Michigan, and an office in Detroit where she helps the homeless and drug addicted. A proud Boy Scout and Cub Scout mom, a wife of 14 years, member of the APMA and MPMA, a member of the Council for Asian and Pacific Americans, Dr. Webster has made her life mission providing services to less fortunate and also giving her voice in her belief in voter integrity. Now understand, what I just stated was just an abbreviated introduction of each of our wonderful speakers. So please take the time to explore their website and their social media for more information and introduction to the work. So without further ado, I would like to take my time and introduce our first speaker, Kimberley Grayson.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "As long as the mind is enslaved, the body will never be free." It is an honor and a privilege to be speaking with you all this afternoon. My name is Kimberley Grayson, and I am an educator, the proud principal of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Early College, which is a 6th through 12th grade school in Denver, Colorado. Systemic racism runs rampant through our education system, and we have to acknowledge that Black excellence is never achieved without meeting resistance in the form of institutional racism. And this dates back years prior to the Civil War. We all know that formerly enslaved Black Americans saw the ability to read and write as a necessary stepping stone to wealth and respect. That was during the Reconstruction era. A century later, Black children were denied access to adequate education, which was part of the Jim Crow era. Mobs of white citizens often burned down Black community schools while government officials stood by and watched. Local officials systemically charged Black property owners an abundance of taxes for schools that our children were not even allowed to attend. Then we have the Brown versus Board of Education that not only made a broken promise to our children, but during this era, Black teachers were fired without cause as part of an effort to prevent white teachers at integrated schools from losing their jobs. And most recently, the No Child Left Behind Act, which really left all of our Black children behind. The list of denial of education and educational rights goes on and on. And these effects of racism continue to run deep in our education system. Segregation, still exists. Resources are still scarce in schools with low-income students. And on top of this, students are experiencing overt racism in their classrooms every day. Despite it all, we still tell our children, go to school, do well, get into college or the military, and you will have a good, prosperous, happy life. We encourage our children and tell them to work hard in school, and you will be rewarded. After all, isn't that the promise of education? Or is it the fantasy of education? Now, I'm not denying that education is important. I just recognize that the path to Black excellence, the path to Black achievement, and the path to Black advancement is easier for some because our children, my Black and brown babies, they have so many barriers to success placed in front of them on a daily basis, beginning from birth. We know that education is liberation. For liberation, you need education. Both of those terms go hand in hand. For liberation, we need education that will inspire our children to think critically. We need education that will free the mind instead of keeping it enslaved. instead of keeping it numb and instead of filling it with more trauma. Yes, education is liberation, yet education and liberation is not something that has been given to us. We have been given a whitewash curriculum, a discipline policy that promotes the school to prison pipeline. We have been given numerous labels of special education to slap on our children, but not labels of gifted and talented that would automatically come with opportunities. Our children, our students, they have the greatest stake in their education, but they have little to no say in what is delivered and how it is delivered. This lack of agency represents a lost opportunity to accelerate learning, teach adequate history, and prepare our students for this world. I truly believe that increasing student voice is particularly important for our historically marginalized population, my Black students. And our system has silenced our students. So let's be clear, systemic racism is a corrosive, widespread problem in our society. And we all need to do a better job of confronting it in our schools, in our community, in our neighborhoods, and in ourselves. I will be joined in my breakout session with two of my high school students and their teacher, and they all are working to confront systemic racism in our school, our district, and the state of Colorado, and also nationally. And this all began with a trip to Washington, D.C. in October of 2019. And it was there when I had to confront the systemic racism and the lack of Black representation at my school and also within our school district. After spending the day at the museum where we were broken and we began to heal, it was then that our students' voice became unapologetic with their ask to ensure that Black history was taught in all content areas. You see, my students were sick and tired of Black history being taught in just one class. And they were sick and tired of hearing the same history that has been taught since kindergarten. Black history is American history, and it should be treated as such. This is when the work began for my students. I watched them become great leaders, great thinkers, and great communicators. They have unapologetically spoken to the superintendent and her cabinet, as well as all of the district leaders, to begin the discussion of why Black history is important and why it should be included in all content areas. They bravely spoke to all of my history teachers who are white and asked them to please take a trip to the African American Museum in Washington, D.C., so that they can firsthand understand the curriculum that they're teaching our students is whitewashed and not representative of students of color. Together, my students and the staff, the history teachers, created a presentation to present to our entire faculty and the Board of Education. In March, the pandemic hit, and we were all sent home on remote learning, which slowed down our process. With the death of George Floyd, our students knew it was time to commence change, and they created their student-led podcast called No Justice, No Peace. And that has resulted in 2 series and 8 episodes. At the conclusion of the first episode, we decided to write a resolution that was passed unanimously on October 22nd by our Denver Board of Education. This resolution made it mandatory for all schools within Denver Public Schools, kindergarten through 12th grade, to teach Black history in all content areas. The resolution also included mandatory professional development to all teachers and leaders, and a clause to ensure that this history focuses on the contributions and celebrations and not just trauma. The writing and passing of this resolution brought forth the vision to create another podcast series that was focused on their resolution and how district leaders will begin to implement it and be held accountable. I'm excited that you will have an opportunity to hear from my students and their teachers in the breakout room. They will speak to you about the elevation of student voice, their podcast, the resolution, and how they're holding people accountable for the implementation of such. They will also speak to you about their campaign for justice. The only way to break systemic racism and ensure that our minds are not enslaved is through inclusive education that will ultimately provide liberation. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Evangeline Covington. She is going to speak to us about generational and racial trauma in the healing in the church.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be with you this evening. And I am going to speak with you about hope for healing generational and racial trauma in the Black church by speaking truth to power and racial divisiveness in the American church. It appears that the history of the church in America mirrors the history and uniqueness of the American caste system as we have come to know it. Based solely on a doctrine of separation, according to lineage within an unequal power structure, it continues to exist as a separate and unequal yet powerful institution in American life and society. However, this is not a format that is based on Christian principles. There is an urgent need for reconciliation and healing of spiritual and other wounds in the church. It is remarkable that the formation of the Black church came about through trauma and suffering. African Americans are notably descendants of the 12 million people who were forcibly brought to the Americas, trafficked, and enslaved for over a 400-year period. Today, human trafficking remains a dirty but profitable business that is based on demand and supply of humans for the purpose of providing labor and sex. Currently, it is the second largest criminal enterprise in the world, and it is believed that there are approximately 40.3 million enslaved people worldwide, providing traffickers an approximate annual profit of $15 billion. However, those numbers pale in comparison to the numbers of enslaved Africans who were trafficked and forced to procreate in order to increase the labor force and profits for slaveholders and others who benefited from slavery in this country. Add to the fact that African Americans, unlike other people groups who have received reparations, have never been compensated for their labor or for the loss of their identities, histories, names, languages, families, properties, and their very lives. Recipients of reparations include slavers who were reimbursed by the US government for loss of their human property, Japanese interred by the US government during World War II, and Jewish survivors of the Holocaust interned by the German government. Gabby, could we please see the photo? We are looking at the church tower of Cape Coast Castle, located in Ghana, West Africa. This is one of 40 or so of the commercial forts built during the slave trade by Europeans on the Gold Coast. This is how it looks today. More likely than not, the first glimpse of a church structure for the first enslaved Africans was the church tower or spire, customarily positioned directly above the slave dungeons where human cargo was secured while awaiting export and sale. The result was that the church itself provided a virtual symbol of power of the oppressors and control over the persons who became enslaved. Although enslaved persons were put through a ritual of baptism, denoting conversion to Christianity before their transport or sale, they were not welcomed into the fellowship. In spite of this, the majority of enslaved persons and their descendants developed a reverence for and desire to embrace Christianity. In spite of the fact that the American church was birthed in suffering and unspeakable traumas over prolonged periods of tough times, it has prevailed. However, the experiences of loss and suffering have never abated, and worshipers continue to grapple with the heavy burdens that are unique to Black congregations and affected persons and institutions in our communities, including segregation within the church itself. However, we know that separate is not equal or based on Christian principles. Gabby, can we please show the video?
I think it is one of the tragedies of our nation, one of the shameful tragedies, that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is one of the most segregated hours, if not the most segregated hours in Christian America. I definitely think the Christian church should be integrated, and any church that stands against integration and that has a segregated body is standing against the spirit and the teachings of Jesus Christ, and it fails to be a true witness. But this is something that the church will have to do itself. I don't think church integration will come through legal processes. I might say that my church is not a segregating church. It's segregated, but not segregating. It would welcome white members.
Thank you. In this video, Dr. King spoke of how the church fostered and promoted segregation of races in worship and in the church. He stated that it is within the power of the church to change its system of segregated worship. So now let's examine the effects of people with more power in the church or in the community. What is it that they experience? Can we please share chart number 1? Thank you. The American Bible Society notes the following points when attempting to understand how power works. In a given situation or community, these are some of the effects that people who have more power may experience. Fear of violence and overreaction to keep the power dynamic status quo, possibly using violence and political power to do so. Isolate themselves from the larger society and lose touch with the experience of others. Have the power to write history and define identity from their perspective. Impose their culture on others. Be blind to privilege and not feel responsible for the way society works. Feel they can express their emotions freely, including anger. Have more desirable options in life. So what is the effect of generational trauma experienced by people with less power? Conversely, we see that people with less power in a situation or community may experience a disproportionate amount of violence from outside and within their community and lack of police protection, limited, less desirable options for housing, jobs, medical service, loans, law enforcement, education, marriage, and so forth. Isolation, loss of diversity, polarization, lost history and identity, fewer resources to address issues, being trapped in cycles of hurting people, being ignored or misrepresented in the relative history, need to contain their emotions, especially anger, around people with more power. Thank you. While European American descendants accept positions of entitlement, the great majority of African American descendants still deal with the after effects of slavery that work to hinder their progress, as well as their full assimilation into this society. It is crucial that whites and others look beneath the surface of societal norms in order to see the effects of trauma on African Americans, on themselves, and on others in the wider populace. Generational trauma can be described as a wound of the heart, much like a physical wound. However, A wound of the heart is much worse because it is not visible, but shows up in a person's behavior. This kind of trauma happens when heart wounds are passed on from one generation to another within families and across communities. Additionally, when the society is structured to discriminate against and disadvantage certain groups while favoring others, heart wounds will more likely occur. Although many other communities have suffered injustices, African Americans in particular have been additionally burdened to live with the disastrous effects of slavery and systematic destruction of the family. The evidence of the wounds suffered by African Americans is not always outwardly apparent. These wounds can manifest in behavior and life circumstances that are akin to untreated sores. Whatever one's position is on race and class, true healing cannot occur until both sides come together to explore our histories and inflicted hurts, and take responsibility for the creation of an unjustly imposed second-class heritage. Now, let's talk about healing generational and racial trauma in the village. Due to the institutionalized racism and the systemic destruction of the African American family unit, generational trauma healing and racial trauma healing go hand in hand for African Americans. By use of generational and racial trauma healing, trained facilitators can assist African Americans and others in examining the effects of continuing inflicted traumas. Necessarily, participants in the healing processes must be made aware of the part European descendants and others have played, knowingly or unknowingly, in the injustices during distinct periods in our country's history. Could we please see chart number 2? Thank you. On this chart, we see periods of tough times for African Americans from 1662 up to the present time. Here we see the periods of chattel slavery from 1662 to 1863, Reconstruction and Jim Crow from 1865 to 1964, and the new Jim Crow from 1965 to the present. Exploring our history together allows people of European descent to recognize that slavery contributed to unjust social systems that impact Americans and Black Americans in particular to this day. However, all are impacted by the generational trauma in this country. People of European descent can experience wounds to the soul from living among or contributing to unjust social systems. It is important for Black and white Americans and those of other ethnicities to allow God to heal our generational wounds. We found that we can speak to power, and we can speak truth to power through lament. Lament is an effective way to alleviate pain in our hearts and lives, and it is a good way to talk about it with persons who are intentional about listening to us. It is important to give people an opportunity to talk about their issues, cares, and concerns because it helps them to gain an understanding of what happened to them, to accept what happened to them, and then ultimately to be able to trust God to heal them. For biblical examples, we can look to the laments of the prophet Jeremiah and to 67 of the Psalms composed by David. These writings are excellent examples that show how they express feelings of pain and remorse without condemnation by communicating with God and trusting Him for assurance. When composing the lament, people pour out their complaints to God in an effort to persuade Him to act on their behalf with unwavering trust in Him. The beauty of the lament is that it can be easily done by an individual or by a community. Laments are well known in many ethnic groups and they are a good way to express deep emotion. For those who want to experience the power of this tool for themselves, for use in their churches and wider communities or organization, we will have an opportunity to do that in our breakout rooms. I would like to hand this over to Savannah Eldrige, who will be speaking to us about the effects of systematic racism on persons returning to the community after incarceration and the impact of incarceration on them, their families, and their communities.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Savannah Eldrige. I'm the founder of Be Frank for Justice. And as was mentioned, I started Be Frank for Justice to help families navigate through the appeal process here in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. However, in helping these families, I also saw the need to empower them and educate them on the steps that we need to take in order to help their loved ones manage and adjust to either their sentencing or those social determinants that led to their incarceration in the first place. As a nurse, I recognize that, biologically, the healing process has to happen from the inside out. And so predominantly what we try to do is give folks the tools and the resources that they need in order to facilitate that. Much of the conversation and evaluation about mass incarceration and the state of the carceral system has really been heightened by the book, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, and also the Netflix documentary, 13th. These sources of media raise greater awareness about the effects of the prison industrial complex on communities and families. The documentaries had highlighted America's false war on drugs, which in actuality was a genocide on Black families. When former President Reagan took office in 1980, the total population, or the total prison population, was 329,000. And when he left, about 8 years later, that had essentially doubled up to 627,000. So this in part was due to the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which allocated billions of dollars to this so-called war on drugs and basically paid states to either incarcerate people or find places to put them by expanding sentences on marijuana penalties, and then also establishing what many have come to know now as the federal, the mandatory minimums. During the 1980s, about 80% of crack users were Black. And of course, these policies ripped apart Black families one by one, leaving many children to be raised by extended relatives and some even orphaned. These policies were further exacerbated by President Bill Clinton's 1994 crime bill, which our sitting President Joe Biden has actually publicly taken credit for spearheading and supporting early on, right? And then it led to more cops, more penalties, more prisons, but essentially no solutions to the problem. Although the legislation, pieces of legislation came forward later on during the recognition of the need for prison reform, acts like the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 sought to kind of undo some of the harms caused by Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administration. But let's make no mistake about it, the American government is still waging a war on drugs while simultaneously profiting from it through marijuana sales, while men and women, many sentenced under some of these mandatory minimums, are still languishing in prisons today. And that is despite similar rates of drug use across different races and different ethnicities. However, people of color make up nearly 60% of those incarcerated for drug offenses. It's important to point out the incidences of racial disparities and discrimination that we've identified pretty much at nearly every point of the criminal legal process. Over about a decade or so, again, as more research is coming forth, and more with technology and social media, we're able to see that these conversations are increasing about what they're calling mass incarceration, which, essentially I'm on the fence about, because mass would mean like largely, and we know that these are disproportionately affecting certain people. So I necessarily would not call it mass incarceration, but for the sake of staying true to the definition, I'll just say the overpopulation of jails and prisons. So research has taken shape to paint a more holistic picture about the collateral consequences of the harm of incarceration. And while every person and every family struggling with financial insecurity also struggle to navigate through it, we know that the impact of incarceration is disproportionately felt by families and communities of color. And that's due to market disparities that are already existing in policing and prosecuting, and of course, over sentencing. Systemic racism and oppression in the justice system can be perpetuated by people, whether they're racist or not, because it's fueled by laws and the governance intended for all people, yet it yields a disadvantage to only a few. From arrest to pretrial, conviction to post-conviction, families are struggling to survive and heal as a result of the trauma that's caused by incarceration, because many are left literally holding the bag while trying to maintain economic and financial stability. America spends about $80 billion per year on incarceration. The cost of incarceration is a hefty price for the families to pay, many of whom are already impoverished. In Texas, for example, while there has been a policy change to drop calls, the cost of calls to 6 cents a minute, it's still yet another expense for the family. The state prison system nets about $84 million a year from goods and services of incarcerated workers, yet they pay them nothing. So the families will bear the brunt of all the costs associated with maintaining those familial relationships and ties that are necessary for re-entry and positive outcomes post-incarceration. Now, on June 17, just a couple of days ago, we witnessed a historic passing of the making Juneteenth a federal holiday. However, but for many of us who have loved ones who are incarcerated, outside of celebrating the sacrifices of our ancestors, we're still struggling with what to essentially celebrate, because our loved ones are still in prison, working without wage, without oversight to the hours, without labor standards, and many of them are suffering punishment. They are suffering from being put in solitary confinement. Some are physically and emotionally being abused with no recourse. I don't think it was a coincidence that this legislation was filed on the same day that the abolition amendment was filed, which would essentially remove the exception clause from the US Constitution. I do feel like it's putting the cart before the horse. And so we need to keep fighting in that respect to make sure that everyone is free in America. There are also costs associated when someone has a loved one who's incarcerated. And I'll just use my family, for example. Right now, I have two siblings. They're both incarcerated, one in Texas and one in Oklahoma. And I also have a son who's incarcerated in the state of Texas. So essentially, all the immediate males in my family are currently incarcerated. So the costs, most of them are associated with food outside of the 3 meals a day that they're given. And just to throw that out there, when there's a holiday, most prison systems serve 2 meals a day due to working on a skeleton crew. There's costs associated with visitation, whether it's transportation or hotel accommodations. If you live far from the prison unit, I live about 8 hours one way or the other from my loved ones. So I usually have quite a bit of cost associated with visitation. In Texas, there's no air conditioning in the prison system. So, we get to triple digit temperatures out here. It was 101 degrees yesterday. And of course, I have to make sure that my loved ones have fans in order to just be comfortable. And also healthcare. In the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, there is a copay associated with sick visits. We did pass legislation to reduce that cost from $100 yearly copay to $13.55 for each sick visit. However, if the person is indigent and a loved one puts money on their books, then that money essentially is soaked up by any outstanding cost that the loved one may have. So this has really become a public health issue. A lot of folks have trouble discerning where like incarceration intersects with public health, but imagine needing to go to the doctor and putting it off because you cannot afford it. And then you're granted, parole and you come out into the community. And you have this health issue and you have this sickness that's been exacerbated from the lack of treatment because you essentially couldn't afford to go to the doctor. And so we're seeing an overlap of these types of things into the community. Whereas, in a state like Texas where people work in prison and don't get paid anything, my thought and notion as is a bunch of other reformers and people with common sense is nothing plus nothing equals nothing. So folks should not be expected to yield a cost when they're not yielding any revenue. We know that incarceration affects children at huge and great risk. Children of incarcerated fathers experience more intense material hardships, both during and after the prison term. And most of that is due to insufficient resources because most times, if the father is the provider, then, all of the brunt work is left to the mother who then has to take up that slack from the father. A father's incarceration is associated with a higher risk of homelessness, again, due to lack of resources. And this is especially true for African-American children. 2/3 of families have a hard time meeting basic needs after a loved one has entered the criminal justice system. So incarceration places the family in trouble in many facets of life. And sometimes just the stress of the consequence of criminal behavior itself can be an issue. It can be a consequence or a problem due to just the separation or from other difficulties faced during the sentence. I know with one of my loved ones, it was a kind of highly publicized case, and it put a lot of stress on my mother because folks were reaching out to her on her social media, and they tell you don't respond or, don't respond out of anger and emotion. But, it's very difficult to navigate through that. And I know there are a lot of families struggling in that same rhyme. If the primary provider of the home is removed, this can also cause, again, significant emotional duress for the partner and the children, especially if there were children in the home. Parental incarceration can be more devastating, and this is what research shows, can be more devastating than divorce and or death of a parent. And I feel like having a parent who is incarcerated, my thought is that sometimes when you have a parent incarcerated, they're not gone, right? They're still living, they're still around. So if there's a disconnect in communication and you're not able to get to that parent, sometimes that can be more traumatic than the finalization of death or even divorce. So I can kind of identify that just through my own personal experience and personal struggle. Oftentimes families struggle with what to tell children, especially if the person is going to be gone for extended space and time. One of my brothers has a life sentence, and we most recently, I want to say last week, he just told his son, the truth about his sentence, and he struggled with it. Just because, his son was excited about the prospect that, he could come home soon. And so it was very hurtful to have to tell him the truth that, we're going through this appeal process, and trying to help him understand all this, and still be supportive. So I do understand, there's really no clear answer. I've heard that some folks tell their children that their loved ones off to school, sometimes off to work. When I was younger, I was told the truth about my mother's incarceration. But at that time, I was actually old enough to understand and know and see at the time that she was struggling with addiction. And speaking of women, the incarceration rates of women has soared to nearly twice that of men, again, leaving many children to be raised by extended family. 80% of the women and children are mothers. And much of that has been affected by one of Clinton's laws, which basically terminates the parental rights of the child if the child has to go to foster care and they're in foster care for 15 months consecutively. So just say a mother has to do 2 years in prison. If by chance she does have to get her child, removed from custody because she doesn't have any family available to take care of the child, if the child has to remain in foster care for 15 months, then that mother will lose the rights to her child and have to find some type of legal recourse to regain custody. And considering the fact that the average prison sentence exceeds 22 months, incarcerated parents whose children are placed in foster care, of course, are at a risk of losing custody of their children. For those who have family members, this usually leaves your grandmama, your big mama, whatever you call it, your aunties, and all those family matriarchs left to care for the children. I was fortunate to have my father and my aunts who stood in the gap during the time of need, but not all children are as fortunate as I was. So I want to just talk about what are some of the things that you can do to get through this? And it's so timely named that this webinar is called It Takes a Village, because it truly does take a group and a community effort to address the insurmountable barriers that people have to face when trying to really get back on the right track. And so the first one is communication. The communication as a family and as a community, it's so essential in order to keep those familial bonds intact. And it's a catalyst in successful rehabilitation and the reduction of recidivism. So we should all work as a community to remove barriers to communication, whether that's cost barrier. Most of the time it's cost barrier, but it could be something as simple as it could be a language barrier. So whatever barriers are identified, I've had to help. I'm not fluent in Spanish, but I know some. I live in Texas, and my father is fluent in Spanish, so I am able to communicate in Spanish. But when I'm not, if it's another language, I try to have somebody who's able to communicate with my families and with the loved ones to make sure that we are meeting the needs that they have in their time of need. And then also communication is essential because we always want to be able to advocate and promote access to in-person visitation. So communication, not just in the form of telephone or video, right? But it's no substitute for in-person visitation. Human touch is necessary to human life, and we always want to preserve that in any way that we can. The next thing is education, and the previous speaker, Kimberley, spoke about education being liberation, and that's very true, because that's one of the things that we teach in our organization, is that education is the pathway to freedom. And it's what we do to teach our families about how to empower themselves to help their loved ones, whether it's learning about the visitation policies in the prisons, learning about legislation that will essentially help their loved ones, or help other people. I feel like an informed decision is the best decision as a family and as a community. So one, we try to identify the needs of the family and then give them the tools that they need to learn, and then they can go out and teach others. So another component of that is the grievance process, because there's a lot of issues in the prison system, whether it's state or federal. So it's really important that we know the way the process is supposed to go so that we can speak to it when it's not being run the way it's supposed to. And then knowing who is responsible for making things right. In Texas, people with lengthy sentences are not eligible for programming. And so that's, again, education is a huge component of reentry. And so a lot of families bear the brunt of paying for that. There is a cost associated with it, whether it's a certificate program or whatever it may be. I pay for like anger management classes for my loved one because he's not eligible. So again, making sure that, the folks on the inside are not just sitting there. I don't want to say sitting there, but, they're actually useful. Their time is actually useful to their rehabilitation. And, what they need will be dependent on, their individual case and their individual resources available. Because some people have help, they just need, additional assistance, and some people have no help or support. Support systems are essential in getting through incarceration. I also often call families the first responders to reentry. And I know that, again, from personal experience, just, having to support so many of my loved ones who've been struggling with incarceration and just the revolving door or the criminal justice system, because we know that, like, families are essentially, they're not good in supporting if they don't have a good foundation, a good base themselves. So I feel like counseling is very important. It's essential. I know there is a stigma in, the Black community about mental health counseling and mental health therapeutic intervention, but it is essential to make sure that we're able to understand what our loved ones have been going through, what we've been going through, and how we can work toward healing together. And one of the other issues with support system is that sometimes when people have a lengthy sentence, you don't know how your loved one is going to come back out into the community, right? I always believe that mental health counseling and mental health treatment should be not just recommended, but it should be mandatory for people who are coming back out into the community, because they've been affected by post-traumatic stress disorder just by being incarcerated. So we should have those resources available. Like, for instance, my son, who was incarcerated at age 17, when he's first eligible for parole, he'll be 38 years old. So from 17 to 38, even in the most positive environment, there have been a lot of changes occurred biologically, psychologically. And in order for me to best help him, I've got to know what he needs. Now, he's no longer a 17-year-old boy at this point. He's a 38-year-old man. So we have to have those systems in place so that, the people who are coming out into the community and those who are going to step in to assist them are able to do so in a way that they're able to successfully reintegrate, not just in the community, but also into the family, because then roles will change as well. And there's no way to get around that when decades have passed. Family roles will change as well. And then preparation for reintegration, just hitting on, the fact that I'm a nurse and just recognizing the intersectionality in healthcare and incarceration, and that there's a greater need to recognize and address issues early on and not waiting till the person has been granted parole or approved for parole to do something about or help address reintegration. So it should happen as early as possible. Hopefully, as soon as they go into the system, things are being done and put in place. We know that that's not happening, but looking at what can we do as a family, as a supporter from the outside, how can we help our loved ones or our friends get prepared for reintegration, keep them up on technology, current events, current news, things like that, and making sure that, they're kind of like, going along with the times, because, things do change quickly and we just want to make sure that they're in the know. And then lastly, self-care. Self-care is one that's really hard for many of us because, we're used to taking care of people, especially in relation to our family or mothers, we're caretakers, but we can never forget about ourselves. Because, if we don't take care of ourselves, then, we're no good to anyone else. And as more intense research is being done, we will find that there are far greater numbers of lives touched by the criminal justice system, and that the collateral consequences do intersect in various ecosystems. I thought about this more as there's been a shift to recognize the need for increased community resources to combat barriers post-incarceration, like education, housing, food insecurities, lack of gainful employment, and then decreased access to healthcare. And you'll find that most often these issues were what led to the criminal behavior in the first place. So investing and allocating resources to address them is a preventative method to improve public safety, actually. So we have to be careful about allowing harmful messages associated with prison, specifically the notation that prison is a place where bad people go, because that in itself can create a barrier in how we receive people back in the community. And we want to make sure that we're receiving people in a positive and nurturing and welcoming way, so that they'll be motivated to do well and have positive outcomes. The truth is, the effectiveness of the criminal justice system does not function in a way that would allow communities to believe that it's helpful, because the therapeutic resources needed are scarce in prison. 95% of those who enter prison systems will return. And while it's not an anomaly, to have difficulty incorporating them into our lives, it is our responsibility as family members and neighbors to help guide them through the process. Research shows that strong family support is one of the biggest factors in a successful reentry experience. Family is the foundation of a successful and productive society, and any long-term investment to effect change among systems of oppression should start therein, because it's been said time and time again that none of us are free until all of us are free. In the breakout room, we'll discuss what moves families to advocate on behalf of their loved ones, and also explore possible reservations to getting involved and how we may help overcome those barriers to keep families intact. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Wendy Webster, who will be discussing the impact of systemic oppression on health.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Wendy Webster Jackson, and I am here. But first, I want to say thank you to Tina for including me in this wonderful series. Especially on the day of Juneteenth, I think this is just so remarkable, and it's very humbling to be a part of this. The topic I'm going to discuss today is systemic racism in healthcare. How does it affect our health? And I'm a bit saddened to discuss this because I try to treat everyone fairly and equitably, whoever comes to see me. And I always fight against anyone who I do not feel, any other provider, I do not feel giving equitable treatment. So as of the over 20 years of experience, I would like to start right now. I'm going to break it down into two categories. First, it's going to be the extrinsic factors that contribute to the health problems in people. And then versus the intrinsic factors. So the extrinsic factors are actually factors such as the structural healthcare system, hospital care, provider care, things that actually affect the person. So what has been found is that African Americans there's actually true disparities in healthcare. So as was found with cardiac patients, so you can go to your cardiologist. We can have an African American patient, go to the cardiologist, a Caucasian, Asian, go to the cardiologist. Many times the African American patient is just told, okay, do diet, exercise, and maybe some pills. So we're counting everyone having the same problem, disease state. The Caucasian and Asian patient might actually be given options such as surgical intervention sooner, transplant list if they need it. So that's actually been documented. And also one of the things that I found is in vascular care, especially in the South, that many times what the vascular surgeon does, he's referred to find any types of disease in the arteries, the veins, or the lymphatic systems. And what happens is a lot of times the African American is just sent off for amputation immediately, instead of trying to find out, is there any other way we can get blood flow down to these extremities? That was very troubling. But there are being strides made to actually go ahead and address this issue. So that's one of those. I'm going to discuss that a little bit later, what's going on. Now, we also see problems with emergency room care. There is found a 10% likelihood of a difference in between an African American, Caucasian, Asian, everything else being they won't be admitted to the hospital. So if everyone goes to the ER, it's found that the African American is going to be said, okay, here, you're fine, go home. Whereas everyone else might be admitted for further treatment. And that's disturbing also. And we also found that in pregnancy, that's a problem because African American women are 3 to 4 more times to die in pregnancy or even after pregnancy. Now, they're not really sure why. Is it because there's a lack of prenatal care? But it is a proven fact, and those are the statistics. And that's sad also. And also pain management. So if everyone goes to the hospital, and it's a proven 73% of the residents coming out of hospital have a preconceived notion that African Americans have a higher tolerance of pain. So they just don't feel it. So you don't need to adequately medicate them. So African Americans' pain is devalued, and they may be undertreated for their pain. And as we know, everyone has pain endings and they feel pain. So that's just the extrinsic part of this. So now the intrinsic part is where it gets more interesting, because as we know, in the society today and in the past, African Americans have been under a lot of stress. We have been marginalized in society. We have to fear for if police brutality. Sometimes mothers are afraid if their son's going to come home. So job prospects, life expectancy, sometimes are your neighborhoods safe, or what's going to happen? And that causes a lot of anxiety and depression in the community. And some of those results are that you find it's going to lead to poor eating habits. So the depression, the anxiety, if you just lackadaisical, just don't care because you have the hopelessness of everything, it leads to the situation where you may not eat the most healthy food. So then you start spiraling out of control, because as we've noticed that the health care for the mental health is not taken as seriously in the African American community. So we have this poor eating. And also that can be contributed to, hey, in the neighborhoods, do we have the best supermarkets? Do we have the freshest food? And a lot of times that's not the case. I don't think it's a Whole Foods in every neighborhood. I don't think it is in lower socioeconomic areas. So we may not be have access to that. And sometimes it's a lot easier just to grab some chips or some Vienna sausage or some canned food, something like that. And that is not good for your health. So as we have the poor diet, it can go and lead on to obesity, which is one of the starts to insulin, the lowering of insulin resistance, which can cause diabetes. Then we also have the poor diet can cause hypertension. So when you have diabetes, hypertension, that leads to a myriad of other health problems. So think about it. You have the hypertension, you can get a stroke because your blood pressure is too high. An artery in your brain can get blocked quite easily. So you have stroke, that leads to debilitation. And so all starting from anxiety and depression. And then also you have diabetes. What do you get from that? That weakens your heart in some cases, especially if it's uncontrolled. Then you can have heart attacks leading from that. Then you can have the amputations because you have neuropathy. You don't have a sensation going on into your toes and even sometimes in your fingers. And it just leads to a lot of things. So it can be marginalized in the African-American community that the mental health crisis and toll of what the effect it really has on there. And this is a very serious issue. So what I am finding out that as far as the extrinsic, what can we do? Because it's like, okay, we know the problem. What is the solution? So what I have looked at, and I must admit, I am in the state of Michigan, and our Governor Whitmer, has actually signed into law that prior to any provider getting their license renewed, we have to take bias training. And that is so important. So you'll know African Americans do feel pain more. African Americans' symptoms should be taken seriously. African American children should be looked at closely and just not dismissed. And then also, I would say, as far as the village and what people can do privately, if you feel that you are not getting the health care you need, report the provider. Now, normally, hey, all of us doctors stick together, but if someone is going against their Hippocratic oath, which we all take an oath, do no harm, and we're going to treat the patients correctly, what you have to do is you report that person to the state licensing board. And I would hate to go to that level, but if they're not doing what it takes to be a doctor and take care of you, then that's the step you should take. So that's something you can do for the extrinsic factors. Now, as far as the intrinsic factors, and I'm going to go into this more in detail in the breakout room, I want to go over different types of activities and stress relievers that you can do to help deal with a lot of these things. So, but what it does, it takes the community to actually get together, because I think, me personally, it starts in your neighborhood. Because we used to have this village where everybody looked out. So how do we get together? I think parents and children need to be a start. Whoever's in that nucleus in the household, talk to your neighbors. Get out and walk the streets. That's going to give you two things: exercise, and then it's also going to get a community unity if everybody can get together. And I guarantee you, a lot of the people who may be committing the stressful crimes on you, they might think twice if they see a big neighborhood group just walking and almost patrolling the streets, but they're really doing it for unity, where you can talk, you can communicate. So that's one thing I suggest. And number two, I think we definitely all need to go and check on our senior citizens, because they are the core and the bedrock of the communities, honestly, because they have the experience that we need to go forward. So check on them, and if they can't, invite them out to walk. Go see what they need, and just make sure, hey, is Miss Smith, is she eating properly? If she can't get to the grocery store, she may be at a disadvantage to getting good food. So I think we just have to step out of our own circle and go out. But I think as it starts with the neighborhood, you can reach out more, and it can spread out further from there. So I really think that that's where the village comes in, is in your own backyard. And I think it can be done, because most people do not live alone. They live with someone that's related to them, or whatever the situation is. And you go there and you just start it out like a small amount of yeast and bread. A little bit of yeast can make a big movement and fluff up. You can get a loaf of bread from that. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Pamela Burton, and she's going to continue everything. Thank you so much for having me. And I'll see you in the breakout room. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. And I have to thank all of our excellent presenters. I don't know about everybody else that's on right now, but this has been very inspiring. And I know you just cannot wait to get any more information and interaction in the upcoming break sessions. Because this has been really, kind of emotional, inspiring. I don't know what other emotions we can all talk about. What we're going to do, even though we're probably going to go a little bit later or the total overall event. But we're going to take a quick 5-minute break just so that all our presenters can get set for their rooms. And then I'm sure many of you maybe just need a little bit of emotional break, some water and everything. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a 5-minute break. It is going to be a tight 5-minute break. We want everyone back in time. I'll call out to make sure everyone's there. And then when we come back, I'll give a little bit more instructions of what's going to happen with the breakout sessions. And then we're going to go from there. So thank you, and just enjoy this little break. Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time for the break, and we're glad to be back. So let's talk about our breakout rooms. So what's going to happen? We have our wonderful technical assistant behind the scene, Gabby, who is going to be breaking everyone out in the group. Each presenter will, as mentioned during their presentation, give more detail. At the end of about 15 minutes and wrapping up that session, we will move the presenter. So for those, again, who aren't comfortable with Zoom or anything, don't worry about it. We are going to move the presenters from one breakout session to the other. While you're in your breakout session, to get the full effect and to be able to communicate either by opening your mic, or in some cases, the presenter will say that you can enter the information in your chat. Make sure that you're on kind of the gallery view so that you can see everybody else that is on the session and talking. So I think we're set. So Gabby, take it away.
Thank you so much. All right, everyone, welcome to the breakout room. Glad to see you. And I hope that this will be interesting and informative for you. When people pour out their complaint to God in an effort to persuade him to act on their behalf, all while stating their trust in him, there are 7 parts to lament. 1, addressing God's, for instance, when you say, oh Lord, or God, or you know who you're talking to. 2, a review of God's faithfulness in the past. 3, a complaint. 4, a confession of sin or a claim of innocence. 5, a request for help. 6, God's response. Often it's not stated. And 7, a vow to praise, a statement of trust in God. Not all parts are necessarily present in the lament, and they're not always in this order shown. The only essential part of the lament is the complaint. Okay, can we have the next screen, please? Thank you. Okay, we're going to read Psalm 13, noting the parts of this lament. I'm going to ask for a volunteer to read verses 1 through 2. Remember to unmute yourself, please, to read it.
I'll read it.
Thank you.
How long, O Lord, will you forgive me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart all the day? How long will my enemy be exhausted over me?
You can stop there for now. We just want to note that the first 2 verses were the address and the complaint.
Okay.
Do you want to go on with verses 3 through 4? Thank you.
Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Enlighten my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him. And my adversaries will rejoice when I'm shaken.
Thank you. That was the request. So could you please read verse 5?
But I have trusted in your loving kindness.
Thank you. A statement of trust. Could you read verses 5b through 6?
Okay. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dwelt bountiful with me.
All right. Thank you. All right. So we see that the lament is a wonderful way. It's a wonderful tool to help us navigate pain and suffering, and it provides a way in which the petitioner can ask God to help deliver them from distress. The experience of composing and or praying your own lament can serve as a memorial to the things that matter to you, to God, and it can last for generations. Importantly, laments allow a person to fully express their grief and even accuse God, but it is often followed by a statement of trust in God. The laments encourage people to be honest with God and to speak their truth about their feelings and doubts. Importantly, in a lament, people do not attempt to solve the problem themselves, but to cry out to God, looking to him, not the enemy, as the one ultimately in control of the situation. They ask God to take action to bring justice rather than taking action themselves or cursing the enemy, but by speaking truth to power through lament. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want you as a small group to compose a lament about your own painful experiences having to do with racial and generational trauma in the church or community. So you will have 5 minutes. Well, since we're such a small group, we're going to stay in this group and do a community lament. So we're going to work together to actually compose a lament. The lament is written in this case, but I just want to encourage you that if you ever want to do it outside of this group, it can take any form. It can be a song, it can be a dance, it can be a rap, or any other kind of creative expression. And remember that the only essential part of the lament is the complaint. So we're going to write out the group lament. And then after we write it out, we'll try to identify the parts, time permitting. And we will ask to have a spokesperson from this group to share the community lament with all of us. So does anybody want to just maybe take 2 minutes of quiet time to think about what you want to put in your lament, and then we'll come back and write it out. Also, if you have your Bibles and you want to refer to them, feel free to do that. Okay, so can we share screen again?
Sure.
All right, group 1. Do we have a lament?
And this is just something that you may have experienced racism with, right?
Just
right.
Something in your heart, yeah.
Mm.
Well, I'll try here.
Okay.
I guess what my mind would be, oh Lord, you know, for us as a people to continue giving us strength.
Okay,
Blessing.
you're crying out for help.
Right.
Okay.
Would that be just kind of like continue to
That's a great start.
protect?
Yes.
Bless. Something like that?
Yes.
Okay.
And that's what mine is similar to, but mine is to protect us and lead us into all foreseen differences.
Okay.
So unforeseen.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Differences.
Oh, differences.
Mm-hmm.
Our guest Donald, do you have anything? You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I don't know that mine is a lament. I might have went to the other end and went to the petitioning of the Lord to hear our prayers. You know, where he talks about, you know, wherever two or more gather in his name, then, you know, we can really ameliorate that happening, you know, whatever that issue is, whatever it is that you're petitioning for. And we have been petitioning for our brothers and sisters for a very long time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and yet the circumstances just seem to not change.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they seem to be the same. And so, you know, I guess what my petition would be is to help me see the unseen things that you have done that I may not know, or that I just, or just, because a lot of times things happen on your behalf, you just don't know it. So just to help me know those things. So that's about as far as I got.
I think
Oh.
that's beautiful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. So, Pamela, do you have anything that you would like to?
Well, I did the first one to continue protect
Okay,
us.
well,
unless
I
this-
would just, okay, so remember, the only part of the lament has to be a complaint. Okay, so I'm just gonna add one really fast.
Okay.
Lord, why do you allow the enemy to triumph over us?
Oh, that's a good one. Oops, got pretty good. Uh-oh. Oops, why can't I spell? Try. I'm just going over.
Hey, what's going on? Come here. Oh, Donald Wyatt. Okay.
Yeah.
Hello, Mr. Wyatt. How are you?
Oh, I'm fine, thank you. And you?
I'm very well, thank you. I firstly, I wanted to go over a couple things. Did you have any questions before I do my presentation on different ways we can help with, anxiety and the stress issues?
I thought we were still in our first group breakout session, but I guess.
did too.
No, we switched.
So we've rotated through.
Okay.
we rotated through before we could get to the end of the other session we were doing. Okay, it just happened a little bit faster.
No, in 15 minutes, they switch automatically.
Right, it just happened a little bit sooner than I thought it was going to happen. So I'm sorry, Wendy, could you repeat what you just said at the beginning?
I was just saying, did you have any questions or any experiences with any systemic racism or any anxiety that you may have, or we can have a conversation, but I do have some points I want to make for some self-care and help with anxiety.
Yeah, well, I do have some anxiety around what's happening around voter suppression and the impacts that those things will have long-term on our future as African Americans, on the futures of my grandchildren. So yeah, I do have some anxiety around that.
Okay, so what do you feel like you can do personally to help with those situations?
Well, you continue to stay active and do what you can do around ensuring that the right to vote is always there for us and to maintain those votes. Just stay active, keep talking, keep challenging, keep getting in good trouble, so they say, just keep explaining things and keep making sure that folks, understand that what's happening is real, and it's not too much different than what happened a few hundred years ago. In a very real sense.
Yes. Okay. So are you trying to actually go out and be elected to any type of public office to try to implement change?
No, I'm not doing that. No.
Okay. Okay. That's important. Well, and I can talk about my experience. I was disturbed by this previous election and all this talk of, voter suppression, voter fraud. So what I did was I'm running for city clerk of my city.
Good
so yeah, and I actually got on the ballot.
I will say congratulations to you.
Yeah, well, it doesn't hurt that the incumbent there is under indictment for some, she may be going to prison. I don't know. She may be.
Yeah.
So that does not hurt my cause. But
you see, but Wendy, let me interrupt for just a quick second. See, that's part of the problem that I have. We have so many people that are like that, but it doesn't make a difference.
Well, all we can do is one person at a time. I mean, I'm there. If you ask anyone, I'm known for integrity. That's it. And I may not always be the most popular person because I'm very blunt, but I know what my job will be as city clerk, and my job would be to ensure transparency and voter integrity in my city. And that's the job of the city clerk, is to run the election. That's your main important job. And I want to make sure that every vote that is supposed to be counted is counted. I don't want anyone disenfranchised, regardless of their political affiliations, because I think the right to vote is the bedrock of this country. That's the only way you can implement change, is through the power of the ballot. And it has to be guarded by people who are willing to guard it and to do it with the proper, they have to have the proper authority and the integrity to see that every vote is counted. So my whole point being, I could have sat and complained, oh, this is terrible. But I said, you know what? Well, what can I do about it? Now I'm putting everything on the line to go run, you know, and I might just get in, and that'll be a good thing. But my point is, when we're doing our village and we have these anxieties, there are certain things that we can do. A lot of self-care before we even get to the point where, oh, let's run for office. We can do self-care. And these are some of the points to help alleviate anxiety and depression that I have. Is one, massage. Get massages. A 30-minute massage is not that expensive, and that helps relax your mind, relax your body. That's so important. And then second, change the way you look at things, because you can always find something positive in everything. And you can always learn something from everyone, because you can either learn the things not to do, or if someone says, oh, I wish I would have done this and I would have had a better outcome, why not listen to them and do the thing they wish they would have done? So I think it's certain things that we can do to help, you know, ourselves, and then you can limit yourself. One of my biggest things is I don't listen to the news all day, because I think the news, you have to know what's going on, but at a point you can hammer negativity in your brain and you can see things are worse than they actually are. And I'm not saying there's not bad stuff out there, but everything is not bad, because if you wake up, God gives you the strength to wake up in the morning. It's good. You have a chance to another day to implement change. So that's one of the things you can do. And also, are you drinking enough water? You know, that's one of the things that we overlook sometimes, and it's so important for health. I don't know, how much water do you drink a day, sir?
Maybe 4 or 5 bottles of 16 ounce. Maybe I guess that's 8
okay.
ounces,
So you get
like
your
that.
water. Do you drink other things besides water, like pop?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, so that's one of the things you may want to cut back on a bit.
I do.
You know, you just want to cut back on pop a little bit. And I think that's important. So that's one of the things. You'll be surprised, especially if you ever feel like, I don't feel so energized. So you can do that. And then also, I think, I don't know who your friends are, but we always say, hey, just don't let negative influence inside your house, as far as what people who may have a negative vibe that can just put things. Because some people, you can go around and everything is negative, and you could wake up very refreshed and you feel like, oh, I just want to go back to bed after talking to this person. They done drained me out. So I think that that's important, to watch who we are around and who we let into our circle and the thoughts we have in our head, and then let stuff go. Think about it. How much of our stress is caused by holding on to things, when we really could just say, you know what, is it that big a deal in the grand scheme of things? And I don't know, it could be big things or it could be little things. But even though my field, and I was in the last room, they're like, well, how do you know about treating anxiety and you're a podiatrist? I said, because I treat the whole person. You're not just a foot when you come in my office. I mean, I know everything about my patients. I listen to them. I know who got married to who, when, where, why, everything. And it doesn't hurt to listen. You know, it's a couple extra minutes. And if somebody's feeling a certain way, well, why do you feel that way? You know, I don't just dismiss people of how they feel, because everybody's entitled to how they feel, but I do like to find out, why do you feel this way? You know, and I may not be able to necessarily help why they feel that way, but sometimes it feels better to just hear somebody listening to you. Because think about all these people who are ready to just explode because they don't feel like anybody listens, anybody cares. And I said, you know what? They will not come to my office and ever say, you know what? I tried to talk to her, and that was the last person I tried to talk to, and she blew me off, and I'm just ready to just explode. They're not going to say that about me, because I'm going to sit there and I'm going to listen to you. So, and it's just it's a thing, and it's being so many things, the psychiatrist to the patient. You know, it doesn't take a lot if people are feeling a certain way. So that is why I can talk about this. And I've been doing this for over 20 years. So I have the people that I take care of. And I'll tell you something else. When I see my seniors, I do a lot of home care. And I know in my head, I may be the only person this person sees for the whole day.
Yeah.
So me and my staff better go in there with a smile on our face and be the cheerleader to perk people up. That's what we do. Hey, how are you, Miss So-and-so? Oh, okay. You know, be a bright light in the darkness, because you don't know what depression they may be going through. So that's what makes me uniquely able to speak. And it's just the patient populations that I see. And I know how I treat them, and what allows me to say what I say, because a kind word and a smile can go so far in this life, and it can turn people who were ready to just blow up a building, they can kind of stop them in their tracks. Or a frown and a scowl can escalate somebody. You just might be that one person to just push them over the edge. So my whole point is, does it hurt to smile? And that can help a lot with the depression and anxiety, you know, and just put it on, you know, take it out and just give some friendliness to other people. So, you know, because I know you said you know, it was a lot of anxiety about the voting and everything. And yeah, but you know what? If you go to other countries where they don't have a say, go to China or some of them places where they don't care what you say. They gonna take over and throw you in a box if you disagree. So regardless, we have a lot of challenges in this country, but it could be a lot worse.
Can I say something before they break us out? For my anxiety has been the same for the last, when did he die? Since 2002, when I lost my son through through a shooting of a police. And it was a high profile case, my oldest son here in LA, in California. And so what I experienced in seeing the different shootings and killing here, that's something I wake up to every day. So that's why I went into public service, and I was a town council for elected official. And then I went into more or less a community because I needed more release on my time. So my husband is now a commissioner, police commissioner for the city of Pasadena. So he's picked up where I stepped off for that same very reason.
Oh, wow. I'm sorry to hear that about your son. So you're someone who's actually lived through it. And then that's good to be an advocate for people who have gone through this, because you know, it's a lot of people who haven't experienced it and can say, oh, this and that, but you've experienced it. So you have the feelings, you know, the situation. So I think that's very powerful for this, because I really think, you know, I have a problem with the police when they just automatically want to shoot you. I'm like, that's not what we're supposed to be about. I mean, you know, come on. I'm not against hitting somebody with a billy club if they're a little unruly, but shooting, I think that's just not, I don't agree with that, to be the first line, because other countries don't do that necessarily.
Yeah, I think that's part of the problem for me, is that those are not the things that we're supposed to be about. Yet those are the things we are about. Those are the things that we see every day. So those things cause me concern. So you know.
Oh yeah, no, I completely agree. Like I'm pregnant now. I ain't even tell anybody. Now look, I got a son. I got a baby boy. This is our first son. So of course I'm like, oh wow, having over 30 seconds. I'm almost 50 years old now. Okay, so just imagine that was an older woman having it, but bring the black son in that I'm have to have a talk with and explain, what's what. So, oh no, I get it. I totally get it. But I don't want him to be consumed with it, where he's anxious and afraid to try new things and meet new people, because it's good and bad in everybody, in every race. It's good and bad. And, we have to see it. But all right, thank you. We're rotating rooms now. See you later.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm Kimberley Grayson, principal of DMLK, and I am super excited that you have an opportunity to meet and listen to Kalia Yazar, who is an incoming junior at Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Early College, and Alana Mitchell, who just graduated as a senior from DMLK. And you also have an opportunity to listen to their teacher, Miss Kiara Roberts. She has been at MLK 7 years. She is also a college adjunct faculty member, so she teaches my students concurrent enrollment classes. To the students that want to enter the teaching field, she also is the teacher of the podcast, Young Ladies, and she is also our equity coach for our entire faculty at DMLK. So without further ado, I will turn this presentation over to Ms. Roberts.
Thank you so much, Ms. Grayson. Silenced Black educators are expected to show up, be the voiceless face at the table to check a box and deal with the behavior of students that look like them, often seen as handing down textbook consequences from the school environment. As a Black educator, I have stopped fearing the label of the angry Black woman when it comes to the needs of our students and have committed myself to standing beside them along the way. They have shown me how to be unapologetic when it comes to my truth and dismantling the injustices that continue in the educational system. I am excited for you all to hear from Kalia and Alana as they take you through what student voice looks like, how to uplift it, and their results from it.
Okay, so before we get started, we would love for you guys in the chat to answer this question. Can you recall a time that you felt passionate about something that you wanted to change as a student? What was the response to that desire and how has it shaped you today?
As a student, I remember in high school, we had to memorize the names of all of the Supreme Court justices. And my question was, why? Because they had not done anything for us. But I was told if I wanted to pass the class, I had to memorize them. So I memorized their names and quickly forgot. That helped me to hate history. And I did not like history until I started teaching third graders in Wichita, Kansas, when I started portraying Harriet Tubman. And I made it my mission not to make history undesirable, because history is every day. They are history. And I wanted children to be able to speak their minds. So yeah, it really shaped me. I won't ever forget that day.
Well, I'll tell you my story quickly. Well, since, there's only a couple of us, we can do it without chat instead of through the chat. When I was a student, and I think I was a junior. Yeah, I was a junior. We did not have African-American history taught. We did not have any Black literature taught. We didn't talk about those things in our other subjects. So we had just formed a Black student union called Umoja. And we did that because everybody else had a group. So we said, well, we need a group too. And so we discussed things in this group about what we wanted to change or what we wanted to see in our school. And we decided we wanted to have our curriculum show that, show our history, tell our history, and also to teach about our writers and things like that. So we said that, okay, we're going to go ask. We had a group of people that we went to the principal, talked about it, and nothing happened at that point. So we decided, okay, we're going to boycott, and we were going to walk out on a Friday. And we did that, and we were very, no problem. Everybody, walked out as we said to do, and no ruckus or anything like that. And we went home. I went home, and my mother asked me what was I doing home in the middle of the day, and I told her. And so, because my mother and father both were very, there's no cutting class or anything like that. So I told her what was happening, and she said, well, okay, this time. And but it didn't have to happen another time, because we were able to get African American history taught. And matter of fact, my homeroom teacher was the one who was teaching it. And also we were given Black literature. So I focused on Black literature, and just the idea of doing that, knowing that we could organize, see something that we felt needed to be changed, and that we could organize and have a strategy and a plan and execute it and see it through. That's what it taught me how. And I use those same kind of strategies now in my life throughout.
Thank you. Actually, I love that, to be honest, because within our own work, it's kind of hard to find people who have taken on similar journeys as ours, and even be connected to people who kind of paved the way for us to be able to speak on things that we care about and talk about Black history today like y'all did in the past. So we greatly appreciate that. Like, actually, that's like, I can't even explain it. And I don't want to get too caught up, because I can honestly talk about this all day, but for these next few slides, we just want to talk about why student voice is important. And specifically to us, student voice is important because it helps educators and other people who are willing to listen see how much they can actually learn from a student perspective, because the student voice is one that's often ignored. So it's always good to hear from the unheard. Students can also feel as if their voice is valued when it's actually valued in the classroom, and that's an important skill to have outside the classroom, knowing that your voice has value and people will benefit from hearing from it. Leaving students in the classroom, leaving students out of decisions and what they can learn creates a disconnect between what you think they want versus what they actually want. And lastly, teaching things that students are actually passionate about gives them starting knowledge to do more outside of school in that area. Like teaching students about activism in the school gives them a jumping off point to actually do their own activism outside the classroom. And right here, obviously within a lot of our activism, it's rooted in collaborating with adults like Ms. Roberts and Ms. Grayson. And in this graph here, it shows how those can promote student voice. First, starting with expression, this can be volunteering your opinions, letting student contributions be acknowledged by adults, just letting students know that their opinion matters in the classroom. With consultation, this can be sharing feedback and opinions in focus group or survey, and also giving students a medium to give their opinion out in a formal way and letting them know it can actually happen eventually. Participation includes allowing students to participate in meetings with decision makers, which lets students know that they have a seat at the table and that they're not just screaming into an empty void and that people are actually listening to them. In partnership, this includes giving students explicit and institutionalized roles in decision making, which is not only giving students a seat at the table, but to just directly do what they want and not have to go through a bunch of systems to be seen as legitimate. Through activism, this can include adults personally identifying problems and solutions and advocating for change alongside students and not just staying on the sideline, letting them take all the heat. Lastly, within leadership, this entails co-planning, co-executing, and having shared responsibility for outcomes with your students. This outcome, or the outcome from all these steps of action, can be improved inclusion, better integration, transformation, and better empowerment of students in general that we have experienced. We also just think that adults can help by supporting students in every idea they have. There's never any such thing as a bad idea. Amplifying student voice and not just listening to them and then throwing away what they have to say, by standing by them even when you're faced with opposition or discomfort, which happens a lot in activism, as you guys know. And don't, especially if students are directly critiquing you, don't take their criticism as disrespect, which is something that happened to us earlier on in our activism, where the adults we were critiquing saw that as us disrespecting them. Give them resources, connections, and a platform to speak out. Don't speak over them or take credit for their work. And often, especially in our scenario, with student voice, it can feel like you're sticking your neck out for a cause others might not support you in. Teachers can give students support and letting them know that they are not alone in their fight.
Good.
So we started our podcast after the murder of George Floyd. After the murder of George Floyd, we realized that we could no longer stay silent about issues in our communities. So we decided to start a podcast as a form of protest. Our first series focused on Juneteenth and the real meaning of the 4th of July, generational trauma and how it still affects us today, and Black history representation. Our second series was focused on keeping our resolution alive, and we talked to a lot of important people in Denver public schools and asked them important questions centered around our resolution.
And speaking of our resolution, there's a quote here from our resolution that basically summarizes what it's doing. But our resolution basically declares that all of the changes and commitments that the district and our last interim superintendent and our incoming superintendent must take on in order to incorporate our ask of more inclusion of more Black, Latino, Indigenous, and minority history in DPS-wide curriculum. So basically all across Denver public schools. And this includes curriculum revisions, feedback loops, internal and external curriculum review, revision, and resource adaptations, and professional learning for teachers and leaders. So it was something really big for us in our resolution. And as you can see here, this is actually our actual resolution that was passed by the Denver School Board. It was actually passed exactly 1 year after we took a trip to Washington, D.C., which started more things we'll talk about later, our BSA, our podcast, everything.
I have a question. Are all the teachers on board in the Denver public schools? Are they on board with this?
Oh, I was unmuted. I'm sorry.
Oh, are the teachers in the different schools on board with this? And I didn't mean to interrupt your presentation, but I was just curious.
No, Ms. Muse.
Okay, continue.
Yes, that was my So we ended our second series with meeting with two of our local city police chiefs, Denver Chief Payson and Chief Wilson. We knew that the only way to decrease police brutality and increase knowledge about Black people not being inferior was to get them in a space and have the conversations. We did leave the conversations resting assured that they had enough knowledge to dismantle those systems of racism that came from the slave patrols that have built our police systems.
So some examples of promoting student voice for us would be founding the BSA at DMLK, starting the No Justice, No Peace podcast, starting the BH365 Student Advisory Board, and becoming members of our school governance board. Some outcomes from these so far have been from founding the BSA at DMLK. It has brought in students a sense of belonging and has given them a safe space to talk about oppression in our country. And starting the podcast, it has brought about our resolution. starting the BH365 student advisory.
Really just want to center the conversation around the advocacy of family members, taking a look at how we can empower family members to be advocates and be better advocates, and if there are any barriers or reservations, how we could work through them. And so one of the things that our organization that we do, and I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but is just make sure that people have the tools and resources that they need in order to be a better advocate. We were in our legislative session from January to May. And so we were needing a lot of family members to come and share their stories and to lend their voices to certain bills and pieces of legislation that may help their loved ones in one way or another. So we had over 100 parole bills filed, specifically related to either, conditions of parole, the makeup of the parole board. There are a lot of different bills. And one thing that we did was we got training for folks on how to, one, provide testimony. So we had some samples of testimony for family members. There were written samples, and then there were some folks that we were able to speak with, and they would run through their testimony, and really trying to get a gauge of what it would look like to be able to compact everything that you need in the required 2 minutes that they're allotting you for the testimony at the Capitol. We tried to prepare them for doing news interviews. So we had a reporter come out and just kind of basically do a mock interview around whatever bill it was they were testifying for. So if they were going to testify in support of the bill that would change the makeup of the parole board, then we had some questions that we configured, and it was a real back and forth interview just so that they can get comfortable with that type of interaction. And then providing financial support, which is a huge barrier, and it was and is a huge barrier for a lot of our families. They don't have a lot of times the vacation time to come and take off during the day. And so, if they did, they didn't have the gas money or they didn't have the hotel accommodations. So, one of the factors is, not only are they willing to, and then, once they get the training, but, can they take the time off to come out and be available during these weekdays? And then, 8 to 5 hours. And then with COVID, we also, in addition, have to take into consideration who had their vaccine, because that was a real concern. And here in Texas, they were swabbing folks to make sure that you were negative. We did have a couple of people who wanted to testify, but they swab positive, so they weren't able to provide their testimony. So, those are the types of things that we're trying to do is, in the advocacy world, there are more people who would like to share their stories. So giving them the resources and tools to do it in a context that would be helpful for their loved ones. And then also my concern is allowing them not to be exploited, because we see that a lot with a lot of these organizations, especially with formerly incarcerated people. They come out, they want them to tell their stories. Now, these people are trying to build their foundation. A lot of them don't have jobs and they're not offered any compensation. So I'm the one that's like, hey, they need to be paid. You're asking them for their story, you're going to get paid for your news story or whatever. They need to be compensated, because it is traumatic to tell these stories over and over again. And so I don't think that it's wrong for, a loved one even, or someone who's formerly incarcerated to ask to be compensated for sharing their story, because it's going to be helpful. It is therapeutic. And the news entities, the media entities are going to get paid for the success of their story. So, if they reach out to you, it's just no more than fair. So that's one of the things that we do to work toward helping people, again, like lend their voices to this work and the advancement of like having positive outcomes, not only just in the criminal justice system, but out, you know, as people are coming into the community, like identifying what resources they need to not only get out, but stay out, right? And so a lot of it is just partnering, because we know that there are organizations who are doing the work, but we have to connect people to those entities. So, you know, I have my master list and I have my peers, and I try to do the best that I can to connect people. As a nurse, I even went so far as to have my friend who's a nurse practitioner provide a telehealth visit for one of my clients who was on a chronic high blood pressure patient, and they only left the prison with 10 days of medication supply. So she saw the person on a televisit and was able to call the prescriptions in. And then all I had to do was then pay for the visit, and then we paid for the medication. And, you know, as a nurse, you know, I'm telling her, make sure you do the generic, because, you know, and so those things, it's just so helpful, you know, have people in different walks of life with different types of knowledge, because there's so much work and so much help that people need in order to be successful out here.
Ms. Savannah?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Just does the affordable health care bill, now that they've continued to fight for it to still become, you know, in existence, to still be in existence for the country, they call it Obamacare. But because of that, are you able to get that kind of help for the former, you know, people who've come out of prison? Do you direct them to different programs like that?
Yes, we direct them. So community health services are our first network of resources, right? Because most of the time people don't have the income to do anything other than get these county resources. But the main barrier to those is a lot of times the prisons are supposed to provide them with identification, and they don't. So our first job is making sure they have an ID, because believe it or not, they don't have one. There was a man, 40 years in prison, came out, had nothing. He had no social security card, no identification. So while he needed health care, he couldn't identify who he was. He had no citizenship. So we have to do, that's our first thing. That's the first thing we have to tackle. Because, you know, sometimes people, I have a guy, he was out 2 years. Now we had already helped him get his information, but the prison sent it to him 2 years after he had gotten out. I mean, by then he would have had a job and all these things. So, you know, identification is critical. Birth certificate, helping people get that social security card. The longer they've been in, the harder it is to get it, because a lot of times they don't have any surviving family members. So that can be a big barrier. And then the healthcare, you know, component of it. If they don't have any chronic issues, it's not as difficult. But for people who really need help, immediate help, you know, and there's that lag time, you've got to find a way to, you know, bridge that gap until they can get approved, until they can see the doctor. And, you know, it just depends on, you know, if they have their identification, there's no wait list, we can get them in. Otherwise, you know, it's a case by case basis. So that's why, you know, when I started my organization, I was just working on court stuff. But, you know, people were having more and more issues. It's like, you know, you have the means to help them, you know, you're going to help them. So I really felt bad narrowing it down to say, we're only going to take people who need help with their court cases. But we have a family member that's saying, I need you to help me with my son's court case, but I don't know how to type up this letter, or I don't feel comfortable speaking to a legislator, and things like that. So, you know, we step in where we can, you know, where the families need us, basically is what we do.
Mama! Oh my God! Oh my God! No! Didi, no! I can't! I can't! Didi, y'all, can I please go see? Mom!
Wanda, listen.
Okay.
We're gonna appeal the case.
Okay. Can I go see?
Can you please? Wanda.
Can I go see?
Wanda, in a little bit, they're gonna take him across the street.
Mom!
You're gonna have to calm down. Come on.
What? Oh my God! Fucking baby, that's my.
I was able to record this video after my brother was sentenced to life. And I recorded the video on a premise that it would allow one of my other siblings to see how their actions were affecting us as a family, you know, and supporting them in what they were doing. And so, you know, my mother, I told her, you know, my brother was sentenced to life, and she really had a difficult time with hearing that information. You know, and it's an everyday thing. You know, COVID, you know, has had a dramatic impact on everybody because our visits were shut down for a year. And in Texas, we don't have the electronic email back and forth. So you kind of just email people and then you wait. Sometimes you can take 3 weeks before you can get a letter back. And so it drastically decreased communication. And that had an effect on, you know, the people on the inside and the family. So again, like the overall goal is to just help people navigate through this entire process and come out on the end better than they were. Or if they can't be better, they're not going to be unaffected. But if they can't be better, not be in a worse position than they were before having the interactions with the justice system. Did you guys have any feedback? I know we talked a little bit earlier. But Gabby is recording. Again, like my whole premise is family support. And, you know, like with this webinar, it takes a village. Like I know better than anybody else, like it really does take a village in order to help people get through this process, not unscathed, but healing, right? In a process and in a way that they can learn from it and use it to help someone else, you know. That's what's helped me. It's been so therapeutic for me to be able to, you know, identify people going through the same thing and say, hey, you know, this is how it affected me, but, you know, I'm still able to, and it's not easy, right? But I'm still able to move forward, you know, and I'm going to use the tools that I've learned to help you do the same so that you can pay it forward.
Thank you. I believe all our participants are back. Thank you very much. I hope everyone enjoyed the breakout sessions and learned a lot of information. Some of the items in the breakout session, we'll make sure that everyone gets posted and receive information. So with that, I would like to turn it back to our hostess for this evening, Tina, to close us out for this event.
Okay. Thank you, Pamela. Welcome back, and I hope that you have been inspired with our entire Village Talk series from learning our history while defining the village concept, extending from Africa into the formation of our culture here in America. We learned what our village looks like today, informing us to what and how our communities were and are being impacted from outside and from within. As years moved on and generations continued, there are things that have not changed for the Black community. The bitter root continued through slavery and systemic racism. However, one aspect that has changed and may make it more difficult to deal with racism is our proximity to one another. Once integration, we no longer live in one segregated community, many times living in more diverse neighborhoods located in suburbia. Presently, in the urban areas, we are dealing with gentrification of our neighborhoods, further changing the village concept. And that allows that closeness is something that we always had before. We always had the racism, the bitter root of racism and slavery that existed when we were segregated. But what the difference was is that we were all located together and we had built a community. The community that was similar to what you saw with the massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So you could see how a community thrived and was close and supported one another and took care of one another, and also protected one another against outside forces. and things that were happening. However, it is my hope that through our presenters, you were able to open up and expand your horizons of understanding and compassion concerning what we are dealing with today. You have been given some tools that you can take back to your families and your communities to make better connections while extending a hand, uplifting and being supportive of each other, our neighbors, and our communities. I would like to take this time to thank Judy Matthews and National Congress of Black Women, the San Gabriel Valley chapter, for providing a place for the Village Talk series, and to our gifted moderator, Pamela Burton, for her participation. To all of our presenters, Kimberley, Evangeline, Savannah, and Dr. Wendy, thank you for sharing your vast knowledge and expertise in your respective areas and giving your time and effort to participate in this event. I also want to give special mention to the students and their teacher guide from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Early College from Denver. Aunt Harriet would be amazed at your young age and how progressive and innovative that your thinking is. So I really congratulate you all and just keep on growing and doing what you're doing. Thanks to Gwen for being a willing host on a moment's notice. And to Gabby, our Zoom manager, you have been patient in sharing your expertise and putting together each of our Village Talk events. I thank you so much. Last but not least, thank you to Michael Hagans, who has allowed us to use his music throughout our Village Talk series, and to Roy Hill for his beautiful solo on the violin. You can see all of our Village Talks by going to the National Congress Black Women San Gabriel Valley chapter webpage and click on the link to those recordings on that YouTube page. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for more events sponsored by National Congress of Black Women San Gabriel Valley chapter, who is uplifter of Black women and for families. Thank you.